which is in more severe ones you can do the Glasgow-Coma scale to measure level of consciousness. But with the VA, the veterans who are coming in with brain injury who have not been diagnosed previously, it's much more complicated than that.
I was going to ask, can I have a TBI and not know it?
It's quite possible. The symptoms that you may be feeling or not even aware of it could be from a TBI that was maybe mild, and you had no idea at the time that you had injured your brain.
What kind of symptoms are there with TBI?
Well, what people most commonly think of is loss of consciousness. And actually, especially in sports and maybe even blast exposure, you don't lose consciousness. And sometimes you may not even have what we call altered consciousness, where what we would say is dazed and confused. And that's where the repetitive nature of, in certain occupations, becomes a bigger risk.
Mm-hmm. Does TBI change one's personality?
It's hard to say. Like I said, every brain injury is different. And when you have a brain injury, it has the potential of affecting any behavior that's controlled by the brain. Whether that will actually change a person's personality, it's hard to say. Most likely not. But will they might become more impulsive, quicker to anger? That's possible.
I asked because there's a friend of mine who said she had a head injury some years ago, and she was a very happy, positive person before that, and since then she has been depressed, had thoughts of suicide. She says her personality changed, so I asked because of that, whether she suffers from this. So.
Well, the personality and behavior can be two different things. So if someone is TBI can be a risk factor for depression, and it can be a risk factor for suicide. But that is not changing who the person is.
Right.
The person's still the person.
Okay.
They may respond to stress and stressful situations different than they did before, but they're still, and we all have to remember that they're still that person.
Right. Sports-related and blast-related mild TBI. There is a difference between the two?
Between blast and sports-related TBI?
Yeah.
Yes. So when you're talking about sports, you're talking about blunt force injury to the head or a severe rotational injury. And so the head is being shaken violently in one direction. That's called rotational injury as opposed to blunt force if you hit head-to-head. Or if your head hits the ground. So that's one type of injury. The other is from blast. So blast is, the knowledge that blast can injure the brain has been around since World War I. But now we're seeing it in our veterans that don't have any other injuries because of the body armor that they wore. And they're being exposed repetitively to that blast. So blast is much more diffuse injury than what sports injuries are, and the changes that it can cause can be much more microscopic than what can take place with a blunt force injury.
Veterans are they more susceptible or more at risk for TBI than Joe Q. Public?
Well, it depends what Joe Q. Public does. So there's certain occupations that put you at a higher risk for brain injuries, such as playing football. And the same thing, a lot of the occupational roles that service members have in the military can put them into greater risk, whether it's through training or through combat operations. Being exposed to blasts or parachuting, some of the obstacle courses where falls are a risk, that increases your risk for being exposed to a situation where you can get a traumatic brain injury.
How do you treat a TBI?
It depends on severity. In moderate severe brain injury, there's a lot of monitoring of the intracranial pressure that can build up in the brain due to bleeding, and that pressure needs to be released, or it can affect the person's life, their survivability from the injury, But most of what we see in the VA is related to a remote brain injury. That means a brain injury that occurred a year or more before they even stepped foot into the VA while they were in the military. And that is much more difficult. And VA research is actually focusing on how to diagnose and monitor those people much more effectively.
Okay. What do we now? What's new? What do we now know about TBI that we didn't before? Anything new?
Our knowledge of TBI is rapidly increasing. I would say we're like in a golden age right now. We're realizing that TBI affects more than just cognitive issues. It is also a source of chronic pain. It can maybe lead, especially in the repetitive brain injury, to neurodegenerative conditions. And we have an active program with the Defense Department. It's a consortium that we both fund called the Chronic Effects of Neurotrauma Consortium. That is attempting to understand these aspects better by doing a longitudinal study and developing better tools to both diagnose and monitor and hopefully in the future treat brain injuries better.
Is there such a thing as a cure for TBI?
The dogma in brain injury is that the brain does not regenerate. There has been some evidence that may not be true. But to cure it, it's a relative term. So a person with mild brain injury, they have symptoms. They have visual symptoms. They can have headaches. If you treat those conditions, that person can lead a high quality of life and may not be affected by any of their aspects of their brain injury. So it's a relative term. A person can have 12 concussions and be perfectly fine. Another person, 1 concussion, they will have lasting symptoms that affect their quality of life. Mm-hmm. But seeking treatment is the number one way to help with any of those conditions. How
do veterans and how do they find out about any research programs going on? Where do they go?
That's a great question. We have a website that is chock full of information, both about brain injury and about other conditions, as well as ongoing clinical trials that are being sponsored by the VA. And that website is www.research.va.gov. That's www.research.va.gov.
Is that the same address if we wanted to, if Joe Public wanted to know more about TBI?
That's correct. And for Joe Public, if they want to find out about clinical trials, both on TBI and all other conditions, the government has a great website for that, and that's www.clinicaltrials.gov. That's a vast clearinghouse for all ongoing and recently completed clinical trials.
I wish my friend, I'll tell my friend about that. Maybe there's something that can help her. Dr. Hoffman, I thank you for some time out. Best to you in D.C.
Thank you.
Dr. Stuart Hoffman there, Program Manager for Brain Health and Injury Portfolio in the Rehabilitation Research and Development Service at the Department of Veterans Affairs. That is a mouthful, but he knows of what he talks about. And if you want to know more, again, go to research.va.gov. research.va.gov. And we'll put a cap on it for this edition of Conversation Collage. Thank you for being with us. Appreciate you tuning in, logging on, downloading, however you do these. Remember our Facebook page and our Instagram page, both available at Conversation Collage Podcast. Communicate with us. We'd love to hear from you. All right? Ken Johannesson here. Catch us next time. Be good to yourself.